It's my pleasure to welcome our speakers, Professor Merike Blofield, who is Director of the Institute of Latin American Study at the German Institute for Global and Area Study, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Hamburg. I'm sure many of our audience are already familiar with Professor Blofield's research. But of course, I want to say a few words about our research. So we know, like you all know, that Professor Blofield has published extensively on various topics related to the intersection of socioeconomic, gender, and family inequalities, and the policy process, the politics of reform in Latin American countries, especially. Among the publication, I would like to remind you of two monographs, one on abortion politics in Chile, Spain, and Argentina, and a comparative study of domestic workers' rights in Latin America, as well as many other articles and publications on inequality, poverty, and redistribution. Most recently, Professor Blofield has co-authored the report and collaborated with the Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean on government social protection responses to COVID-19. So without losing any further time, I just want to leave the floor to Professor Blofield, who will be talking about family change and political responses in Latin America before and since COVID-19.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited and really look forward to your questions and comments. Hannah, please. Sorry, my daughter is talking to Hannah, please. Okay. Working from home. Sorry about that. Okay, so on the topic of family changes, so what I'm going to do today is I'm very much looking forward to talking to people who are both Latin America specialists as well as social policy specialists and experts who don't do Latin America. But what I'll share my screen now. Let me know if it comes through okay. Can you see all good?
Yes, very
excellent.
Perfect.
So family changes and incipient political responses in a context of high inequalities, Latin America before and since COVID. It's a bit of a mouthful. And the presentation I thought I would do, it's a bit of a mouthful too. What I will do first is discuss some of the family changes pre-COVID related to a book project that we were working on, as I say here, based on co-authored projects with Fernando Filgueira, who's a sociologist in Uruguay, and Cecilia Gianbruno, who is also in Uruguay. And we were working on family policies and fathers. And then along came COVID, and all three of us redirected our energies to looking at what was going on related to social policies and especially social protections as COVID hit the world and the region. And so I will also discuss that. So the presentation is actually, in that sense, it's quite descriptive and empirical more than perhaps starting from a theoretical puzzle and the literature, but I will actually present you with some of the massive family changes that have been taking place in the region and the way they are filtered by socioeconomic inequalities. As Latin America is known as the most unequal region in the world. And then I'll discuss some of the key post-millennium, so over the last 20 years, policies on related specifically to families. And I'll cover very briefly cash transfers, which is something that is very well known. A lot has been written on it. A little bit on care services, especially early childhood education and care services, and then focus a little bit more on the subject of our research, which is paternity policies. Especially then I'll kind of bring it together in terms of Latin America in 2019, pre-pandemic, and then discuss, which I also had the honor to do at Oxford in in November, in one of the Latin America series, I actually presented on social protections during the pandemic. So I don't want to repeat everything I did there, but I will bring some tables and PowerPoint slides on that issue, and then discuss the implications going forward. And if somebody has questions or comment, I don't know what the format is, but if I don't mind being interrupted if you have any questions along the way. And I'm also happy to share this PowerPoint. There'll be a bunch of graphs. If anybody is interested, you're more than welcome to email me. So to give you an idea, and for some of you, this will be very familiar, but especially for those who are not Latin American specialists, I thought it would be helpful to put Latin America into perspective, especially for the Europeanists. This is not unusual. Massive social changes in Latin America, the increase of women's employment and labor force participation, broadly a global phenomenon, not everywhere, but in the Western world, certainly. What makes Latin America stand out is that it's filtered very strongly by class, and the labor force participation rate gap between women of a higher and lower income quintile in Latin America, I believe is the highest in the world. And so this hones in on the gap, as well as the issue of families. So this is the labor force participation rates of mothers with children under 6 years. And this data is from UN Women report in 2017 that was produced by two of my co-authors, actually, Fernando Filgueira and Juliana Martinez Franzoni. By quintiles, and you see very clearly the differences there. Basically, women's labor force participation in the lowest income quintile plateaued, and in the highest, or in the higher ones, it kept going up and is actually very close to men. And this is related to, and also the types of jobs. It's a visual presentation of kinds of job creations and jobs available to these different women from different income quintiles and different socioeconomic educational attainment. And of course, this is related to the sexual division of labor at home. And here are two graphs that I really like. They summarize a ton of information. This is from my sociologist colleague, Fernando Filgueira, based on time use studies, of course. One is Uruguay here on the left and Ecuador on the right. And what this shows is housework and childcare by age, by class, and by sex. And so here you have, if you look, and I'm sorry, this is in Spanish here, but to translate the solid lines are men, okay, in both cases. And so the blue is the first income quintile. The gray one is from the middle income quintile, and then the top income quintile or fifth income quintile, the orange, is orange, the solid one, okay? And then the same but broken up is women. So blue, gray, and orange in both cases, and then the life cycle effects. And so what you can see here very clearly is that women pick up a ton of the domestic work, especially when they hit childbearing age. So in their 20s and their 30s and also their 40s. And it is also clearly differentiated by class. And so you can see like the orange dotted line here, women from higher income classes are able to outsource a part of that work, in many cases to women from the lower classes, of course. And so you can see the gender effect, you can see the class effect, and then you can see that men basically don't change their behavior at all through their life cycle. So you have a class, you have both the sexual and class inequalities demonstrated in these graphs strongly. And of course here, I wrote a book about this, the phenomenon of paid domestic workers, that is a very important modality of resolving care issues among the top 20 to top 40% of the population. So that's like a labor within the home. What you also see in Latin America over the last few decades is massive family type changes and household type changes in terms of family composition and marriage rates. And here you see Latin America standing out. This line here is for births out of wedlock in Latin America, which is the highest in the world. From when we have the data from the 1980s up until 2014, it's close to 70% now. And the other region that comes close are Nordic countries. And of course, some of the dynamics driving these changes are similar in Nordic countries in Latin America, but some of them are also quite distinct. And this graph here shows Latin America and the evolution of urban nuclear male-headed households and female-headed households with children as percentage of households with children. And this basically is driven by two phenomena. The green line is urban biparental nuclear family households with male heads of household. And the blue line is urban households with children with female heads of households. And what you see here are two phenomena. One is that you move from just traditional breadwinner families to dual earner families as women join the labor force, and they might start classifying themselves as female headed, but not necessarily just male headed, but it can go either way. And so partly this is also just an issue of how ECLAC, this is from ECLAC, classifies this data. And then the other issue is that an increasing number of these households are female headed households, as in single mother households. And so this shows the two trends taking place, which are kind of mirror each other and are very strong in the last 2 decades. And Chile, I like this graph. This is an extreme example. Chile is an extreme example. This is from a newspaper article in El Mercurio, the conservative main daily newspaper in Chile that published this graph. And this is children born out of wedlock in Chile. And so from 1960, when 16% of children in Chile were born out of wedlock, so the heyday of the traditional male nuclear, traditional breadwinner family, to almost 75% by 2017. So the region is going through massive changes. Then I have a few graphs, and I'm sorry for the messiness. This is actually our own calculations with Filgueira and Gianbruno based on Luxembourg income survey data that we were working on right up until COVID hit to try to look at the interactive class and gender changes going on in households. And let me just explain to you briefly this mess here, and I'm sorry that it's in Spanish. But basically what we did here was we separated the households. This is for Brazil, and then I'll have some data for Chile too, to give you a sense of some of these socio-demographic family changes. From 2013, so this is the lowest third, the middle third in quintiles, income terciles, and the highest income tercile. Then if you look at this dark red, if you look at the sort of more neon red part here, this is your traditional nuclear male breadwinner family with children, the father working, and the mother as a stay-at-home mother. The blue sector here is a family with children where both parents work. And then the red, darker red part is a family with children that is a single mother family, okay? And then the gray, shades of gray are households without children. The wider part is a one-person household, and the gray part is a household, a couple without children. And then the other colors are smaller demographics. You can read them there, but these are kind of the key ones here. And so you can see how this plays out over classes, where in the highest income tercile, you have a larger share. In both the middle and the high income share, you have a larger amount of households where both parents work. And a much smaller portion of the traditional nuclear breadwinner families, a sizable share of single mother families, but then in the lowest income tercile, you see a much larger share of families that are still traditional breadwinner families, and also a significant share of families that are single mother families. And then you can also see that in the lower income tercile, the number of households without children is much smaller than in the highest income tercile, where almost half of all the households in this tercile do not have children, okay? This is Chile, the same for the most recent available data, 2016. So you see again in Chile, some of these dynamics are even more accentuated. For example, the dual worker families are a very small share of households in the lowest income tercile, much higher in the highest income tercile. And you can see the similar dynamic with the single mother households as well. And here, this one shows you the evolution, and I think because the other ones were static and they just showed a cross-section by class, but this shows you the evolution of the lowest tercile in Chile over time. And this is really quite striking and parallels some of that, the Mercurio graph, but gives you the class dynamic a little bit more clearly. So at the time that you basically have democratization in Chile, over half of the households in the lowest income tercile in Chile were traditional male breadwinner nuclear families. By 2006, it's less, and by 2016, it's about maybe, about one quarter. And these are the modern dual career, dual worker parent families. They increase here, but they actually even decrease a little bit here. There's no clear trend towards that increasing, and where you see a clear trend towards increasing as the traditional male nuclear breadwinner family is reduced is to the single mother families, right? So you can really see in the lower classes the movements in family types. And what we basically see, to summarize, and I brought in a reference to S. Anderson, as many of you, if you're social policy experts, you certainly know his stuff inside out. His book on the incomplete revolution that looked at advanced industrialized world. Well, the incomplete revolution in Latin America, yes, it's very incomplete, but it has a very, very strong class component, even more so than it does in advanced industrialized countries. And you have, as my colleague Filgueira says, a socio-demographic transition in disequilibrium. And here I'm citing a forthcoming chapter we have in a book, the four of us together, outlining some of these trends. But what you see is the lower classes where, and this is Filgueira's term, and and this was part of what we're working on in the book, a broken patriarchal contract where you have a move from traditional male breadwinner families that had a certainty, it was in a patriarchal system, but it also had a protective component in the sense of the income pooling in the household, to single mothers, and a really stark trend towards fathers absenting themselves from the responsibilities of the household and supporting their offspring. In the higher classes, you have a new contract, a la S. Anderson, where both parents work. And in Latin America, it's very much also the dynamic of outsourcing care to a paid domestic worker. and also a high share of households without children. And that also has to do with segmented fertility patterns, where there's a huge difference between high and lower income women in the region as to when they have their first child, like when they give birth to their first child. And so there's a movement towards starting childbearing at an older age in the higher classes. And in the middle classes, we see basically kind of both trends playing it out. On one hand, you have traditional families. On the other hand, you have an increased number of single mothers or both parents working. So this is kind of a summary of the socio-demographic economic family changes in the region. In terms of policies, well, the Latin American, this is very familiar. Of course, what we see is the left shift, or the pink tide, that was particularly dominant in the region from about 2000 to especially 2015, during which you had the election of reformist governments, self-identified left governments of different types, that got elected and also often got re-elected, which was an important part of both continuity of policies and also a certain level of satisfaction with the policies that they were promoting. The context, the background, and I've already talked about this a little, but the context very broadly in terms of social policies was one of high levels of inequality and informality. And just to, this is not, here this data doesn't have a gender component, but just to give you the context of one of the key issues also where Latin America is important to understand when if you compare it to Europe and advanced industrialized countries, is the informality of the labor force. Like on average, roughly about half of the working population in the region works informally. So without formal labor contracts, without payroll taxes, without social security and benefits. So this here shows you at once the variation across countries, as well as the variation across income quintiles. To give you a snapshot. So this is employed workers contributing to Social Security as a percentage of the employed population by income quintile. So here you have, for example, Uruguay. And so the highest income quintile number 5 is here. The lowest income quintile number 1 is here. So from Uruguay to Peru and Bolivia. So in Uruguay, 80% of the labor force is formal. And in Peru and Bolivia, the 80% of the labor force is informal. However, in all countries, there's a significant class component to this. So even in Uruguay, less than 50% of the lowest income quintile who work are formal versus over 90% of the highest income quintile are formal. So against this backdrop, one of the key policy innovations of the new millennium, and that also bring us back to the family dynamics, was to create social protection policies to all those outsiders who are not part of the contributory social security system, which were, so it was a large share of the population that were not in it. And those people who were excluded were also, as I just showed, from the lower income quintiles, so in many ways in more need of social protections. And on top of it, they were much likely to have children. And so the key, one of the most talked about and written about policy innovations of the new millennium was these conditional cash transfer programs to families with children in poverty, recognizing that they were outsiders and they were particularly vulnerable. And of course, you're very familiar with this, probably, especially if you're Latin American, is Bolsa Familia, the biggest program of its kind in Brazil. Brazil and Mexico were the two pioneers in this, and Oportunidades and later Prospera and Progresa in Mexico. And what it did was link, first of all, target mothers with this idea, well, mothers are the primary caregivers, which was certainly supported by the data. And also there were many families that were single mother families as well. So it's a practical, pragmatic way of getting money invested in children, and then linked to school attendance, health checkups to promote human capital and to reduce generational transmission of poverty. And these were, I mean, for the purposes that they were created, they were extremely successful in reducing malnutrition and increasing school attendance rates. And in a way, one could, well, there has been a lot written about it, criticizing them and extolling them. But perhaps in some ways, one of the biggest problems with them was that they didn't do enough in the sense of the reach and the impact. And this is from our ECLAC report. They didn't give enough money to enough people. And so while they were important, they didn't really eliminate, well, they certainly didn't eliminate poverty, they helped towards it. And so this basically, this is our graph from our ECLAC report looking at coverage and sufficiency of the anti-poverty cash transfers to families with children in the 10 countries that comprised our ECLAC study. And to explain this to you here, this is standardized across the countries. This is the extreme poverty line for each of these countries. And the graph, the bar is the share of the national extreme poverty line that the transfer gives to a family, a typical family of 2 adults and 2 children. And so we're controlling for the number of household members. So it's kind of a mathematical, so per capita. And so for example, the Chilean transfer would be about 13, if the extreme poverty line is 100 euros, then, or 100 pounds, then 13 pounds per person towards the extreme poverty line. So clearly far from sufficient as the only source of income for a family. And then the blue line is the breadth of these transfers as a share of all children in the country. So share of under 18-year-olds per country who are covered. So for example, in Chile, just over 40% of all children get these transfers, and this is the amount that they get. So Uruguay does the best in terms of both coverage as well as sufficiency, okay? Bolivia has high coverage, but extremely low sufficiency. It's about 1% of the extreme poverty line. It's basically a small annual transfer in Bolivia. So that's the reach, coverage and sufficiency of those policies. Here is a graph regarding services, early childhood education and care expansion. It's how it is stratified by class. And so this is also from UN Women in 2017, this data. And this is ECEC coverage of children under 3 years, so kind of the most critical age. And usually where the rates are the lowest in 6 countries. And you can see that there are countries like, for example, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and Uruguay make significant advances in time from 2000 in the first decade of the 21st century during these left-wing governments. However, and this is just a regional one, we don't really have, this data hasn't been disaggregated a whole lot, the coverage of 4-year-olds by socioeconomic status. And here you see, however, that it's still reaching the higher income families much more than the lower income families. In fact, some of these increases here are particularly marked among the higher income families. So that's a summary of cash and services towards families. Then the issue of fathers that we're particularly have been working on. And here it's important to distinguish fathers into 2 groups because it's not a homogeneous group. First is the ones who live with their offspring or with their partners. And here, one of the key issues, like if we're looking at policies to involve fathers more, like basically paternal co-responsibility policies, the key challenge, that is also one that exists all around the world, is to get them to do more at home, especially, right? To change the traditional domestic sexual division of labor. And here the key policy tool to do so, which is more of a nudge than, you can't really legislate who does what in a household, in a contemporary liberal democracy, is to incentivating, for example, shared parental and paternity leaves, flexible work times, and such. And in an article that came out last October with Comparative Politics, I summarized this with my colleague, Mike Touchton. We basically looked at changes on parental leaves in Latin America and then provided an explanation for it that had to do with programmatic political parties and such. And what you basically see here in just a nutshell, again, part of this empirical overview, is that Latin America compared to Europe, employment-based parental leaves are extremely maternalist. Okay, so the red that you see here, it's like the maternity leave. And what we've done here is we've used an example of, I think it's Ray et al., Ray Gornick et al. From 2010, a way to standardize this information. So looking at fully paid employment-based leaves for salaried workers in weeks. And here we have 2,000, there's a lot of data here, but basically we have 2 data points for all the countries where there was a change for 2000 and 2018. So for example, Bolivia, and then the number 2 is, this is Bolivia in 2000 and Bolivia in 2018. Chile in 2000, Chile in 2018, Colombia in 2000, blah, blah, blah. For all the countries where there was no statutory change, Argentina, Brazil, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, et cetera, we just have 1 data point because nothing has changed. Here I have Canada actually as an insider, sort of a comparative perspective, okay? So the red is maternity leave. So all the countries have paid maternity leave, unlike the United States, for example. The blue dark is paternity leave. And so these are post-birth paternity, like mostly a few days. For example, in Bolivia, it's, I think, 3 days. Brazil has a 5-day paternity leave that allows the father to accompany the mother through the process of giving birth and coming back from the hospital. Then what we have is the gray is the shared parental leaves that became particularly popular in Europe starting in the 1970s when Sweden instituted shared parental leave, and now is kind of the most dominant form. Like if you go to Canada, you can see that, you know, most, like in Europe, maternity leave is, in the EU, it's like 14 weeks to recover from childbirth. So that's kind of standard to have a 14-week. Here for Canada, it's standardized because it's not fully paid. And so it looks like it's like 8 weeks because it's 14 weeks, but you don't get full pay. And then the biggest chunk is shared parental leave. So the state leaves it up to the mother or the father to decide themselves who does it. And then, of course, now you have the famous daddy quotas that basically incentivate, like, use it or lose it, daddy quotas that became popular starting in Sweden, and I think it was Slovak, one other European country, I can't remember which. And now, for example, Germany has it in a bunch of other countries to incentivize daddies to do it. So what you see in Latin America is that it's heavily maternalist. They're not extensive. Now, of course, it's important to remember that these kinds of policies are legislated for the 50% of the population that are lucky enough to have jobs in the formal sector. So it's not that this, like if we legislate a ton of daddy leave, that's going to solve everybody's problems because like half of the labor force is informal, okay? And especially when it comes to mothers and low-income fathers. But here it is still extremely maternalist, restricted to mothers. And you have 2 countries that have legislated shared parental leave in the last 10 years. And those are Chile and Uruguay. So we really dig into the details of what happened there and how did this come on the agenda. And then other countries have implemented these paternity leaves, but no country has a daddy quota to date. So that's putting Latin America into comparative perspective. So I have one PowerPoint slide. Actually, I don't have a time here. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I don't have a clock or a cell phone. Maybe you can tell me, somebody can tell me when I'm starting to get close to my time so I don't spend, I don't go over time because I really want to hear from you. So Then the second, perhaps in some ways most interesting story is the father, also because we know much less about this, is the issue of fathers who do not live with their kids. I mean, and that's one of the key social problems in the region as per the data. So here, the two key policies and what we've been collecting data on with my co-authors is, on the one hand, is paternity recognition. Latin America as a region has very high rates of unrecognized paternity. So simply fathers who do not recognize their offspring, and so the birth certificate only lists the mother. And that has legal and economic consequences. And for those of you who know the region well, also social stigma consequences, because it actually shows up in many countries in your last name, for example. If you're Gonzalez, your two last names, and you don't have a father and it's just your mother's name, and it also has social consequences, basically. It's a big deal. And for example, in Brazil today, one of the interesting things is that this is so unresearched that we don't even have decent data on this. And estimates that have been made, for example, in Brazil is that about 10 to 20% of children born today are born without a legally recognized father. And so here, what we're analyzing, the interesting thing is, of course, that, well, historically, the issue of paternity has been a very, almost a mysterious thing, because we haven't actually had the DNA testing to determine it biologically. And in all countries, basically, there's a presumption that if you're married, the father is the husband of the mother. Nowadays, of course, we have the technological advance of accurate, easy, and relatively cheap DNA testing. And so we actually have the policy tool that if we want to, we can actually, to an extent, we can resolve the issue of unrecognized paternity if we want to do so. And of course, well, there are certainly mothers who don't want a father in the lives, or there's a history relationship of abuse or something, and so it's something that they want to. But there's also a vast number of mothers, having investigated this, who would like that recognition, because it can also then come with legal and economic obligations. And also from the perspective of the child, it's considered, in the UN Children's Rights Convention, it's considered the right of the child to know who their father is. So we've been tracing state policies, because now that we can resolve this issue if we choose to as a society, we've been studying the state responses to the issue of unrecognized paternity in the region. And here overall, it's quite interesting. State responses have been very slow. They've been very reactive. There's some very interesting stories here. They basically tend to make it very difficult for mothers to try to legally get that dad to do a paternity test if he refuses to do so, to the point where women must spend years in court and basically never have it resolved. And of course, if you're a single mother and you're low income and you're taking care of kids, you simply do not have the time or the resources or the skills to do that. However, there are some cases of pioneering countries that have made a huge difference. And here Costa Rica stands out, that in response to about over 30% unrecognized paternity that was determined to be a social crisis in the early 2000s and late 1990s, the president decided we have to change this. So we have the data, we have the DNA mechanisms to do it, and they instituted a policy where basically they put the burden of proof from the mother into the hands of the father. And so basically at birth, the mother was asked, who is the father? She wrote it down, and it was up to the father to prove otherwise. Now, the state made it easy. Basically, they had a state laboratory where you got that test for free. And so all he needed to do was a little pinprick, like a very simple test, non-invasive test to determine whether or not he was a father. And of course, a mother, and so there was that mechanism to do so. And the idea was, well, women aren't gonna, well, if they lie about who the father is, well, that's easily resolved. As a result, within 15 years, the rates of unrecognized paternity declined from over 30% to 10%. And so it's an extremely effective strategy. Now some other countries are moving more towards it, but it has been very reactive. There has been a lot of perhaps elite men have there's some very interesting arguments, like in the case of Lula, for example, in Brazil, and people like they get very uncomfortable about this idea. So we're researching that. And then the second issue is, well, fathers who don't live with their kids, not all are ones who didn't recognize their offspring, but then you also have separated fathers and the issue of child support. And so here we're also collecting data on this, trying to trace it. Overall, as a generalization in Latin America, the vast majority of children stay with their mothers, often even custodial, like the courts tend to rule in that way, and tend to maintain quite irregular contact with fathers. Also, you have low levels of regular formal child support from fathers. We lack a lot of helpful, very well done systematic comparative data on this, but from the data that we have, there are variations by country, but overall, the level of formal support from fathers, it seems that once they leave the household, they tend to lose contact and tend to tend to stop supporting these children regularly. And here overall, 2 states have been reactive, although some are becoming more proactive. Explaining some of this variation across policy areas and across countries. I'm not going to dwell on this. A ton has been written on this. If we go back to the 3 policies that I've been talking, policy types, the CCTs, well, here you have this significant policy diffusion. It's being promoted by left and right governments alike. You have a role of, international organizations, policy diffusion, electoral competition, divided government. There's a lot of literature on this. The ECEC service expansion, you have achievements from across the board in general, some incremental steps, but you see stronger policy efforts coming from left-wing governments. And that is that's intuitive for what we know about left-wing governments focusing more especially on service expansion rather than cash transfers. And this also requires more infrastructure investments. And so it requires more of an active role from the state, like building daycares, employing people in the public, all those kinds of things that requires more state involvement. In terms of paternal co-responsibility with resident fathers, from our analysis, it was quite interesting. Bringing fathers into the picture in cultures and countries that tend to be heavily maternalist, so sort of exalting the role of the mother, but also seeing child caring as primarily a mother's responsibility. You don't see tons, there is some for sure, but you don't see bottom-up social pressure to change that. From our observation and digging into the details of what happened, for example, in Chile and Uruguay, where shared parental leaves were finally put on the agenda, it did not come bottom up. It actually came from expert deliberations. And I can talk about more of that if you're interested, or you can look up the article that we did. And so we see there, you kind of see it's more of this top down. And in some other European countries, you've seen that too. It's more of a top down thing. Paternity recognition and child support, what we see, and that's I find interesting, is that these issues are coming slowly more to the agenda of Latin American countries, or were before the pandemic. Now it's all disappeared. And you see kind of this difference between what we then term protective versus punitive policies. And here, for those of you who know this literature well in advanced industrialist countries, there's kind of the European method, European way, and then the US way. And we're thinking the protective ones, they protect, their goal is to protect the child. So protect the child's relationship to the father and protect the child's well-being and economic well-being as well. And what that means, many European countries have moved to these advanced maintenance policies where they take the responsibility of mediating child support between the child and the mother often, right? Child and the father and the mother. And so they kind of front the cash and then they go and get it back from the dad. And of course, you can see how that's the best for the child because you maintain income. And it can also actually reduce conflict between the mother and the father and the child. That requires state resources. The system in the US is much more punitive, where they basically, if they front any money, they go back and get it from the dad. But basically, it's more of that this is the father's responsibility, not the state's. And so they have, for example, the number of men who are in jail because of child support payments owed in the US is very high. And so the policy impetus there is much more punitive, and in general tends not to benefit the child. And you can see Latin American countries at a crossroads where they're becoming more proactive on these policies. Protective policies obviously cost more, although you can certainly make the argument in the long term investing in children pays off. But you also see this difference between more conservative politicians pushing for these punitive policies and more reformist lefty politicians pushing for more protective policies. So it's an open question that if they become more proactive, what direction they'll take. Okay, that then to summarize very briefly, how much time do I have left? Rosella, maybe you can tell me.
I think like you basically finished your time, so maybe we can...
Okay, well then...
Another 5 minutes.
Okay, sorry. So very briefly, in a nutshell, before the pandemic hit, the share of children in poverty, basically poverty had a child face in the region. Almost half the children in the region were poor. So clearly the policies to help families were not that successful. And also, I won't go into details, but basically low-income households, the vast majority had children and were very close to the poverty line. Okay, so then pandemic social protection policies, what's happened in the last year? Well, very little attention per se to families and mothers and children, but basically what we see, understandably, we've all been occupied with pandemic, how to deal with the pandemic. Schools physically closed in March across the region, lockdown, social distancing measures. Governments moved to provide income support for families, households to shelter at home and to weather the economic fallout that has been tremendous. The IMF just said 7.4% contraction for the year 2020 in the region. And they had to reach 3 groups of households when doing so. Those in traditional contributory social security tended to be better off, right? Those in non-contributory, so the CTT, the families that were the recipients of the CTT programs, and then all the households that fell between the cracks that are a substantial number of people, those who weren't covered in either program, what we call informal households, that depending on the country were anywhere between 15 to 70% of the population. And here, basically, I'll show you the data from our ECLAC report. This is the increased funding given to existing programs since March in the non-contributory sector. And this is specifically looking at the CCT programs for families with children. This is the same graph that I showed you before. And so basically, very quickly, just look at the dark blue here. This is the increase in transfer amount to mothers who had kids in the CCT program. So basically Chile, Brazil, and Argentina really jack up the amount of money they give these families. Peru and Bolivia too, Colombia to a lesser extent, and some countries don't increase it at all. And so, for example, in Chile, Brazil, and Argentina, it brings them above poverty line, okay? Extreme poverty line. So they can basically feed their kids during the pandemic. Here is a very important story of the new policy effort towards all those informal households, most of whom also have children, right? Because low-income households are extremely likely to have children and informal households are extremely likely to be low income. So this is reaching children as well. So this is new cash transfer coverage among those not in existing programs as a share of the total employed population as of last October. And what this basically does is a share. So the gray line is the share of employed workers who are informal. Okay, so this is kind of a control for the size of informality in the country, according to the latest available data from 2018. Then we tabulated against, basically, we kind of look at the total number of cash transfers to these new recipients in these programs. So we minus this from the existing CCT programs and look at, compare it to the total size of the informal worker population. And this is what we get. Basically, what this shows is that the red bar is the new transfers to informals, as a share of the total employed population. And so in the cases where the red bar reaches the gray line, you can make the argument that they are reaching all those informal households during the pandemic, so they can basically feed their kids. And in some countries, they go even further. For example, in Brazil, a lot of, for example, mothers who are not in the informal employed population are also getting transfers. And in Bolivia. In other countries like Mexico, Colombia, and Ecuador, there remains a huge protection gap. In Costa Rica and Uruguay, the effort is not so high, or in Chile, because the level of informality is lower. And so they can reach many of those households through the formal sector. I'm not going to discuss the sufficiency because we don't have time. Potential implications of this variation over the last year. On one extreme, so Brazil was the most generous and the largest coverage in these new cash transfers. By July, it was reported that extreme poverty had probably declined in Brazil because some of the poorest households actually increased their income in response to the pandemic when they got pandemic economic assistance. Now, this was not a Bolsonaro policy. This was passed by the opposition. The other extreme is Mexico, that didn't increase pandemic social assistance at all, just relied on existing programs. And a UNICEF survey reported in September that 80% of households with children were not able to meet basic nutritional needs. Here, something that we're researching that we find very interesting. Remember, the CCTs went to mothers primarily, like over 90% of them go to mothers. The informal households, we're digging up that data, the new cash transfers to informal households, they didn't target mothers. And in fact, it seems that they perhaps went more to men and fathers, because if they went through the informal, like the labor force participation, given the labor force participation gap between men and women, they went more to men. And so we're actually trying to collect what data exists on this, and countries don't necessarily or have not publicized that data. They may not even have aggregated that data. And that has some interesting implications for our discussions of families and reaching children and such. I have some comments about the implications and the duration of these policies moving forward. Many of them have ended, and one report already says that extreme poverty has again increased in Brazil because the emergency assistance has been phased out. We desperately need systematic survey data to assess the effects of these policies. I'm working on a grant application to that effect right now. Finally, what I'm currently working on right now is actually explaining variations in these social protections with Jennifer Pribble and Cecilia Gianbruno. But we can discuss those if you'd like. You can ask me questions about that, but I'm gonna stop talking now because I really want to hear from you. And I'm sorry I went on too long. To my defense, if I seemed a little distracted, my kids were actually running around all over me while I was talking, so forgive me.
Thank you, Merike. I think, we understand, and given the topic, it would be weird if we didn't. But thank you for giving this very comprehensive picture, I think, of family and the care infrastructure in Latin America, and the effect of COVID on social protection. I think you cover so many things, so I'm curious to see, what our audience questions as to